Every day, something dramatic happens in the Caribbean that affects our lives. We'll give you the details. We'll give you the facts on Caribbean Perspective with Eddie Frederick. Here's Eddie Frederick.
So glad you can join us. UN Secretary General advocates for loss and damage for vulnerable states. This story takes the lead in today's edition of Caribbean Perspective for Friday, 23rd September 2022. Details when we return.
The hurricane season is now upon us, so we as Caribbean people need to remember to think safety and be prepared. Avoid venturing outside during a storm or hurricane, especially if there are strong winds. Rooftops and other debris are often blown about and can cause great damage.
Welcome back. Antigua and Barbuda and other small island developing states have received another boost in their call to be compensated for climate damage. United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres echoed that call on Tuesday as he opened the UN General Assembly meeting in New York. ABS's Garfield Burford reports.
The UN Secretary General laid bare the stark realities facing our world as the climate crisis worsens.
The past year has brought us Europe's worst heat wave since the Middle Ages. Mega drought in China, the United States and beyond. Famine stalking the Horn of Africa. 1 million species at risk of extinction. No region is untouched. And we ain't seen nothing yet. The hottest summers of today may be the coolest summers of tomorrow.
Global greenhouse gas emissions are going in the wrong direction, according to Antonio Guterres. These must be slashed by 45% by 2030 if the net zero target is to be achieved by 2050.
And yet emissions are going up at record levels, on course to a 14% increase this decade. We have a rendezvous with climate disaster.
He insists the climate crisis is a case study in moral and economic injustice, as the countries which emit the least greenhouse gases suffer the most from climate change. That's why he wants action on loss and damage for climate disasters, echoing sentiments expressed by Antigua and Barbuda's Prime Minister, Honorable Gaston Brown.
It's high time to move beyond endless discussions. Vulnerable countries need meaningful action. Loss and damage are happening now, hurting people and economies now, and must be addressed now, starting at COP27. This is a fundamental question of climate justice, international solidarity, and trust.
The UN Secretary General also calls for increased concessional funding for developing countries.
Developing countries, particularly small island developing states, face too many obstacles in accessing the finance they need to invest in their people and their future. Second, debt relief. The debt service suspension initiative should be extended and enhanced. But we also need an effective mechanism of debt relief for developing countries, including middle-income countries in debt distress. Creditors should consider debt reduction mechanisms, such as debt climate adaptation swaps.
Will his calls be heeded? Time will tell.
Health officials in Antigua and Barbuda, meantime, says the country is now on the verge of an epidemic of hand, foot and mouth disease. The viral infection has risen sharply over the past few weeks, with young children mostly being the ones with symptomatic disease. Acting Chief Medical Officer Dr. Terry Ann Joseph outlined the figures during an exclusive interview with ABS News and explained what is needed to curtail transmission. Garfield Burford again reports.
We are on the border of moving from the alert zone into the epidemic zone.
The stark assessment from the acting chief medical officer about cases of hand, foot, and mouth disease in this country. Cases this year, represented by this red line, have risen sharply and are now venturing into epidemic territory. The highest annual case count over the past 8 years was in 2017, when 207 cases were recorded. 118 cases have been recorded over the first 37 weeks of 2022.
If it continues on its current trajectory, we could very well surpass the total number of cases this year when compared to 2017.
70 of those 118 cases were recorded just last week. Hand, foot, and mouth disease is a mild, contagious viral infection common in young children. The acting CMO says there is no information suggesting any of the children have developed complications from any of these infections. It normally takes between 7 and 10 days for the infection to clear up. And what are the symptoms?
Adults can have it. And with adults, it's asymptomatic. Right? Children, however, especially preschool age children, so 5 and under, tend to show the signs of the disease. So fever that could last, 48 hours. And then after you could have the rashes appearing. So small red dots, right, appearing on the palms of the hands, the soles of the feet. It could be in between the fingers as well, around the mouth. They at times form what we call vesicles, colloquial terms like little boils, right? And they can be painful, especially those in the mouth.
I asked the acting CMO what has accounted for this sharp rise in cases. She said that is still under investigation by health officials. She declined to indicate whether the ministry had recommended the closure of any preschool for sanitization. She did tell me, though, about the options available to health officials if the cases become epidemic, meaning spread across a wide area.
In general, in public health, whether it is a food safety issue, whether it's an environmental health issue, whether it's an infectious disease issue, there are certain preventative and control measures that can, including closure. But then again, it would depend on the extent of the outbreak at that particular facility.
Meanwhile, her advice on preventing transmission?
Washing hands becomes very important. And I'm happy to say that we visited a few schools and businesses and institutions that still insist that people wash hands before coming inside or sanitize the hands before coming inside. So washing hands is very important. So preschool should continue that as well. And again, the cleaning and the sanitizing toys and frequently touched surfaces.
You're listening to Caribbean Perspective with Eddie Frederick. In other news, Minister of Social Services and Urban Development, Obi Witchcombe, speaks about progress made by his ministry and the Davis administration in the past year since their election to office in the Bahamas. ZNS News has some details with Cleopatra Murphy.
The Progressive Liberal Party has made significant progress during its first year of governance, but Minister of Social Service and Urban Development, the Honorable Obi Witchcombe, insists the Davis administration is just getting started. He says the Ministry of Social Services, through its efforts, is making an impact.
I'm very pleased that we've been able to increase the provisions for our clients, 10% across the board. But there's much more to be done. Too many of our people are still not sleeping with a roof over their heads. Too many of our people are still in search of job opportunities. Too many of our people are still suffering from healthcare issues that we in social services must attend to. And too many of our disabled are still not being considered equal.
Legislatively, he says government has been able to address issues from the blue-orange economy and green economies through the carbon credits bill. With worrying issues like crime, he says the agenda will get even more aggressive.
We want to answer these issues. We want to be able to be that holistic government, the government that caters to all men and people of our country in all the right ways.
With the party touting successes in tourism's resurgence and the rebounding of the economy, Witchcombe says Prime Minister the Honorable Philip Davis is about action.
We're reminded every day, too much talk, he says. Let's get it done. Because over the many years, he's watched Bahamians endure a lot of pain, a lot of hurt. And in particular, you've seen his passion, particularly for those persons who were affected by Hurricane Dorian, those persons in Abaco and East Grand Bahama. And the message to us all is we have to do more.
Witchcombe says ultimately there are many things still to be dealt with, and Bahamians voted the PLP into office because they wanted a better life.
People are going to judge you on your actions, not by your words. You know, action speaks louder than words.
For the Bahamas Tonight, I'm Cleopatra Murphy.
Attention needs to be placed on how people experience the economy when referring to the social development and family services aspect in Trinidad and Tobago. TTT News with Mahalia Joseph Wharton has more.
Speaking to TTT News ahead of the 2022-2023 budget presentation, Research Director at the Women's Institute for Alternative Development, Dr. Deborah McPhee, said factors like national security play a crucial role in a country's social development.
I think a big question for us really is the ways in which we talk about the economy and very distinct from how people experience the economy. And I think that is something that we need to really make sense of.
She said the way in which we view social services and family development must change.
The budget is a process, and I think it's very important that as civil society persons, we are very clear that what is this process, and we must constantly ask, who is in this process? How do we ensure that more voices get inside of that process?
She said violence has a strong impact on family life.
We are mindful of the ways in which we sometimes don't understand the ways in which gun violence touches down as a social reality, as an economic reality.
Dr. McPhee said there is a need for more public education on the other elements of security.
So how are we managing who is allocated funds around mental psychosocial support for families who may experience violence? Who is allocated within our school system?
She said there is a narrow focus on crime as many don't see it as a factor in social development. Another factor, according to Dr. McPhee, is labor.
We need to hear what are the measures that are being put in place that address these issues.
Mahalia Joseph Wharton, TTT News.
Once again innovating the way you shop with its new online store, providing 24-hour shopping convenience. You can shop now for appliances, hardware, houseware, building material, and more. Free delivery island-wide. Start shopping now at hubbardshardware.gd. Safe, convenient, reliable.
I am Eddie Frederick, wishing you a restful weekend. This has been Caribbean Perspective, a whole new approach to highlighting developments in the Caribbean. In the meantime, please continue to log on to CaribbeanPerspective.com for more daily news and more.